Thanks, Dan. And this is our last class in this series on Christian ethics. So in case you haven't been here all the way through, or if you didn't know this was the last one, sorry, but this is it. So covered a variety of topics. This class that Dan taught on homosexuality, and so there is overlap. We'll be referring to terms that relate to those issues, and we won't be diving into that as much as we could if we were just sort of generally talking about issues of sexuality and gender. So this week we're specifically talking about transgenderism. And it looks like the new notes have arrived, and Dan's helping get those passed out there. So if you didn't get some notes and you'd like them, let them know so you can make sure to get a copy of those. There aren't blanks this time around, so you just have to, it's on you to pay attention and write down important things. And we are going to have, we got a few slides up here that hopefully will help illustrate some of these things. So this is the outline I'm going to do today. We're going to first describe the position, transgenderism, and then we're going to critique it. And in describing it, I'm going to first talk about the ideology, the terms that are used, and then get into some of the medical claims and recommended treatments and so on. And then we're going to walk out the same way we came by first critiquing those medical and scientific claims and then critiquing the ideology. And then we're going to go a step further and talk about sort of a Christian alternative to those understandings of self and gender. And finally, at the end, some points on guidelines for how we engage these issues, both in public and in private. And I really want to get to those last points. So I'm gonna be moving here, and if you got a question, then ask me afterwards. All right, so as far as the ideology goes, and anytime we can get that first slide up, Sam, that would be great. I suspect that most people are already familiar with these terms. It's kind of small. You have to use your imagination a little bit, I guess. This is an image of what's called the gender snow person. All right, so a snowman made of 3 circles, right? And then this is a picture from it looks like an elementary school class. In the back, if you could zoom in, you'd see there's a sign on the wall that says, in meetings, we, in the first point, is like hold hands still or something. So that's the age level. And the 3 circles symbolize these 3 things. You've got at the top with the head, gender identity. Then in the middle with a heart, you have sexual orientation. And then at the bottom, you have sex assigned at birth, or biological sex. And then the next one is another version of the same thing, the gender-bred person, right? So we've lost the clarity of the 3 circles, right, corresponding to head, heart, and I guess genitalia. But we've added these sliding bars for the different categories that make it look like it's sort of a coherent system. Though, as we'll see, it's certainly not. And then off to the, let's see, somewhere on here, they've got on here as well gender expression. So in addition to gender identity, your sexuality, your biological sex, gender expression would be how you present yourself, right? Just whether you look like a man or woman, male or female. Okay, so that's broadly the ideology, and I'm presenting it to you in the kids' version, but frankly, it's not a particularly deep system, and it's sort of appropriate. And it also just tips us off to the fact that this is getting presented, at least in some cases. I'm not making any claims about local schools or anything like that, but you can see this is framed to be addressed to elementary school kids. Some of us might question the idea of putting the category of sexual attraction in something that you're explaining to elementary school kids, whether you're teaching a perverted view of it or not. So that's generally the ideology, is that you have these 4 different categories, your gender identity being your sense of yourself as whether you're male or female, your sex being like your reproductive system, right, and your organs as whether they actually are male or female, then your sexual attraction being which sex you're attracted to, or both or neither, or these in infinite numbers. You can see at the top there, it says gender snow person, and it says version 3.3. So these things are always evolving because there's always some other permutation that you got to include so we don't offend someone or leave out some expression. All right, so transgenderism then is understood to be the condition where a person's gender identity, that is how they feel internally about themselves as male or female, and their biological sex don't match up. One's male and the other's female, right? So the way to think about the terms when you hear them is it's the opposite. Right? It's the opposite of what's true. So if you hear a transgender woman, that means a man. If you're a transgender man, that means a woman. If there's a news story referring to a transgender man, and it refers to him as he all the way through, or you're not sure, it just says they're transgender, but it refers to him as he, you know it's a woman, right? It's the opposite. And you can just sort of edit that in your mind as you're reading. And you'll hear the term sometimes cisgendered, that's C-I-S, gendered, as opposed to transgendered, and that just means that your internal sense of gender identity and your sex do align. So that would be like everyone throughout human history until, 15 years ago. That's called cisgendered. So the recommended way or recommendation to deal with transgenderism or to treat it as it's understood to be a legitimate condition that can be diagnosed is to affirm the person's internal gender identity, right? So yeah, what you feel inside is what's right, that's what's really true, and then try to conform their appearance and physical characteristics to match that internal identity, right? And hence the term gender-affirming care. So gender-affirming means you're affirming what they feel on the inside, right? And then you try to make the outside look more like that. Next slide, there's just a 2-page PDF. See the graphic? Doesn't that look just like they do it on TV? Is it blurred out in the back and then the poll quote? Yeah, I made these all for you. So this is a paper from the HHS, Health Human Services, and so this is the federal government, and this quote says, research demonstrates that gender-affirming care improves the mental health and overall well-being of gender-diverse children and adolescents. Because gender-affirming care encompasses many facets of healthcare needs and support, it has been shown to increase positive outcomes for transgender and non-binary children and adolescents. Gender-affirming care is patient-centered and treats individuals holistically, aligning their outward physical traits with their gender identity. Okay, holistically aligning their outward traits, that's the definition of superficial, actually, not holistic. Holistic would be also addressing the internal issues, right? But as I said, everything is opposite, right? Everything is the opposite of true when you're dealing with this ideology and their terminology. So this sounds impressive, though, and if you could see the whole paper, and if you can see this close enough, you'll see there's some footnotes. Like it says, research demonstrates that gender-affirming care improves mental health and overall well-being. There's a little footnote, and at the end, they've got a whole list of papers that they're citing, and you read the titles, and they sound like academic papers. So this sounds kind of legitimate, like they've actually studied this. So gender-affirming care could include, and this actually appears on the second page of this same PDF, but it could include social transition, meaning you start treating the person like the opposite sex, like the sex they say they identify with, which could be changing their name to a name associated with the opposite sex, or when that's ambiguous, using the pronouns for the opposite sex for them, clothing and hairstyle to be those that are typically associated with the opposite sex, and so on. Another one would be puberty blockers. So if a person has not gone through puberty yet, then there are hormones that can be given that will delay or inhibit puberty, which are said to be reversible to a certain point. So of course, what does that mean? They're not. Yeah. A third one would be hormone therapy, which could be given to someone of any age, which means you give extra amounts of the hormone that is more prevalent in the opposite sex. So that would be if it's a woman wanting to be more like a man, you give her more testosterone. If it's a man wanting to be more like a woman, you give him more estrogen. And it can do things like help the woman develop facial hair and deepen her voice, and so on. And then fourth would be gender affirming, in quotes, surgeries, meaning these would be cosmetic, right? Cosmetic surgeries to make a person look more like the opposite sex. We have no way of actually changing a person's reproductive system through surgery. Like, that doesn't happen. But we can, they can cut off the breasts of a woman. They can sort of do plastic surgery on the genitalia to try to make it look like the opposite sex. And some people even undergo like a facial reconstruction surgery, right? To either, if you're a man, like maybe take down your cheekbones and your jawline or something to try to feminize the face, or vice versa. So you're trying to sort of imitate the appearance of the opposite sex. All right, now again from this NHS paper, that'd be the next slide, I think. Got that pulled. Yeah, okay, this is, and I know that might be a little bit small for you to read. I'm going to read it out for you. A safe and affirming healthcare environment is critical in fostering better outcomes for transgender, non-binary, and other gender-expansive children and adolescents. Medical and psychological gender-affirming healthcare practices, again, have been demonstrated to yield lower rates of adverse mental health outcomes, build self-esteem, and improve overall quality of life for transgender and gender-diverse youth. Okay, so they're saying this has actually been demonstrated to provide better outcomes. And then it says family support is important. The presence of affirming support networks is critical for facilitating and arranging gender-affirming care for children and adolescents. Lack of such support can result in rejection, depression, and suicide, homelessness, and other negative outcomes. So that sounds like serious consequences. A common rhetorical shorthand for this that you'll sometimes hear is, say you have a daughter who is saying that she's a boy, and they're trying to encourage the parents to affirm that, and go along with it. Then they might say, well, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter? Meaning, if you don't identify her as a boy, if you don't accept her as a boy, then she's going to kill herself, right? That's the impression, and the thing that pushes a lot of parents to affirm this, because they're told, that there's, like right here, it says it's been demonstrated that these people are more likely to kill themselves if you don't affirm this. All right. So that's some of the ideology and the claims, and I know many of you may already be well familiar with that, and we could go into it in a lot more depth. But we're going to turn around now and start, like I say, walking back out the way we came in, and we're going to start critiquing some of these claims. Okay, so these medical claims, the short version is the science is a sham. Like, there is nothing here. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I did you the favor. I took, for example, this NHS paper and identified every source that was cited, that could be referring to one of these claims, and I looked up all the papers, and none of them prove anything. We'll go into one here in a minute. As I said, it's pretty much in every case the opposite is true. Gender affirming, right, means gender rejecting or suppressing. You're trying to suppress their gender. If they say holistic, it means superficial. If they say a trans person is a woman, it means they're a man. If they say it's evidence-based, it means there is no evidence. All right, I'm a little tongue-in-cheek here, but we really need to have that reflex, because you can be intimidated when someone who has been to medical school, or has some sort of position in the academy or something, is making claims that they say are backed up with evidence. And in this case, it is just not so. Another example, they say puberty blockers are reversible. I think any of us would think, what are you talking about? Like, someone's not going to go through puberty again later in life, right? Like, you can't inhibit that key developmental stage and expect to just run the program again later and have it work, And certainly, it's been revealed, yeah, well, they're not necessarily reversible. They talk about sex change surgery, or gender reassignment surgery, it's sometimes called, which of course is just a false label, right? No one can have their sex changed through surgery. Like, your sex is demonstrated in every cell of your body in your chromosomes, right? They're not going in and changing out your DNA, right? They're not providing a man with ovaries. You know, that you can't actually change a sex. You can only make it, you know, look a little bit more like the opposite sex in a superficial sense. And of course, when they say that gender-affirming care reduces the risk of suicide, what's the truth going to be? It increases it. Yep, it does. Okay, so from this HHS paper, we've got the first study mentioned that is, I'd say, the best one. It has the largest sample size that they've got, that's cited in support of the effectiveness of gender-affirming care. It's related to that first claim that we had up at the top, which said, research demonstrates that gender-affirming care improves the mental health and overall well-being of gender-diverse children. Okay, the study was actually conducted by the Trevor Project, which is an activist organization, interestingly. Purportedly, you know, their goal is to reduce suicide rates. You know, it's a suicide hotline for like LGBTQ people, but very much with the intent of affirming it, you know, saying, you know, you don't kill yourself because you're perfect this way and homosexuality is fine and transgenderism is good and all this sort of thing. Okay, so this is the study that they cite. I think I have the next slide. I think I have a blow up there. Yep, okay. Yeah, you can see, maybe a tiny bit. But here, the present study draws from a large sample of transgender and non-binary youth between the ages of 13 to 24. Okay, this is good. To examine the association between a receipt of GAHT, gender-affirming hormone therapy, okay, so that's getting the hormones, right, for the opposite sex, with self-reported depression, thoughts of suicide, and attempted suicide. So this is whether people say that they're depressed or have thought about suicide. So nothing in this is tracking like actual suicide rates. No actual suicides are reflected in this. This is a survey of young people and whether they say that they've thought about suicide. Okay, how did they do this study? Next slide here. Methodology. This data were from an online non-probability sample collected between October and December of 2020 of 34,000 youth aged 13 to 24 who reside in the US and identified as LGBTQ. Youth were recruited via targeted ads on Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. Okay, that sounds scientific. Qualified respondents completed a secure online questionnaire that included a maximum of 142 questions. Okay, so they are reaching out to people via Facebook and Snapchat and getting them to do an online questionnaire. Respondents were eligible to be entered into a drawing for one of 100 gift cards worth $50 each by providing their email address after being routed to a separate survey. Yeah, this sounds really solid, doesn't it? Okay, but what did this actually find? In bivariate analysis, a smaller percentage of transgender and non-binary youth who received hormone therapy reported recent depression, 61% versus 75%. Seriously considering suicide in the past year, 44 versus 57%, and attempting suicide in the past year, 15 versus 23%, compared to those who wanted hormone therapy but did not receive it. So to be clear, they divided the respondents into three groups: people who weren't interested in having the hormone therapy, people who wanted it but couldn't get it, and people who wanted it and had it. So we throw out the first group of the people who don't want the hormone therapy. Between those who want it but don't have it and those who do have it, there's a 10 to 12% difference in whether they say that they've considered suicide in the past year. So kids who want hormone therapy and aren't getting it are 10% more likely to say that they've thought about suicide, which is not that surprising. In fact, it is a little bit surprising. You'd think it would be higher, wouldn't you? Like, for those who are trying to get the hormone therapy and can't have it, but it's still only a 10% difference. You'll see even among those who are getting it, it's 44% considered suicide in the past year. Like, that's not that low, you know, for an effective treatment. Okay, this may actually be the best paper they cite. Like I said, there were five or six papers that were relevant to the claims I looked up. Several of them were similar to this. They're an online survey, you know, related to self-reported claims on the part of the individuals. Some of them were just showing these transgender youth have better mental health outcomes with good family situations. You know, like you have healthy family dynamics, that correlates to young people who are doing better mentally. You know, not surprising. But there are actual real studies about suicide and gender reassignment surgery. Let's go to the next one here. So this is a study from Sweden. This is a 30-year long-term follow-up study of people who actually had, they call gender reassignment, GR surgery, looking at actual rates of suicide and attempted suicide. So in terms of methodology, it's the opposite in every way. It's not an online survey, it's looking at the actual data. It's looking at actual suicides and mortality, not just self-reported, yeah, I thought about it. And it's actually tracking the individual patients, you know, on whom you have data over a 30-year period. This is with over 300 patients, and then what they did is they matched each patient to a representative sample from the broader population. So they did 10 to 1, so 10 random samples of people their same birth year and sex compared to each person in the study. I said 10 to 1 overall, you know, not like each person only gets compared to those 10. And what do we find in this one? It's suicide rates of people who receive the gender reassignment surgery are 20 times higher. That's adjusted hazard ratio, AHR, 19.1. 20 times higher suicide rates, actual suicides, than the general population. And this is people who received the treatment, not who are denied it, right? This is the treatment that's supposedly supposed to help and make things better. I've got, let's see, next slide. There are other studies as well. Not gonna go into depth on all of them, but I don't know if you can read any of those from where you're sitting, but I'll let you peruse those. Those are some of the quotes I pulled from conclusions on those. Again, one of these is a recent one that just came out in the last few weeks here in the US. It was based on emergency room visits and comparing attempted suicide between emergency room patients, those who have had gender reassignment surgery and those who haven't. And it was a 12-fold increase. So and actually 12 times more likely for these ER patients to have attempted suicide if they'd had gender reassignment surgery than not. Like I say, that one is just within the last couple weeks that it came out. There's another one from Finland and one, Germany, another one from Germany, all demonstrating worse mental health outcomes, higher rates of suicide for people who have had these procedures than those who haven't. And it's not just that this HHS paper, that this little PDF with its links that was put out is weak. There's this major report, you may have seen it in the news, called the Cass report. This is in England. And so in England, they have socialized medicine, right? So the whole medical industry is under the purview of the government. There were questions and complaints about these procedures, especially on youth. They commissioned a report called the Cass report because the leading pediatrician who led the study is, I can't remember her first name, her last name's Cass, Dr. Cass. And it essentially concluded there's no evidence for the claims, there's not evidence that the treatments they're proposing are either effective or even safe. And they actually closed down this gender therapy wing of the Tavistock Clinic, which would be their big psychological clinic. They actually closed it before the report was released. Her conclusions were so strong that she spoke up and released some of them early to get them to close the clinic. This was last year, even before the report was completed. they found, for example, at that Tavistock clinic, 96% of the patients who went there were referred hormone treatments. So you go there to be diagnosed, right? 96% odds that you do have what they are wondering about, this transgender syndrome. There was no follow-up. They don't know what the long-term results with the kids were because they didn't do follow-up. They don't even have records in many cases, of how much of this was done. It's kind of a hot mess, and apparently is likely to be typical. This is not like some sketchy clinic. This was the primary and prominent gender treatment clinic in the UK for their whole health system, right, in the country. There's also another recent release with the WPATH files. WPATH stands for, now I'm not sure I can get the acronym. World Practitioners Association of Transgender, something like this. It's an international organization of the gender therapy practitioners that have online communications and meetings to discuss treatments, right? So it's the organization that has been cited as like, well, the WPATH recommends such and such. Well, there are a whole bunch of leaked files and videos of their emails and conversations demonstrating their own uncertainty about effectiveness of treatments, about whether these things are actually safe, admitting that they don't really know how these hormone therapies work on the body, talking about all the, what they call psychological comorbidities of different patients and how does that relate. There was one exchange where a person was saying they have a multiple personality disorder patient, and some of them personality identifies female and some as male, and you have to make sure that you get consensus from every personality before applying these treatments, and is that at what point, what if there's one personality that decides to change their mind later on, and do you still go ahead with the procedures? Sort of horrified. They said they were acutely aware of the debilitating and potentially fatal effects of gender transition procedures. Yeah, so pretty devastating stuff. So the medical claims are just full of holes. The medical science really is a sham, and so when you hear claims like that, and even you see stuff with papers cited, you don't have to go look up every paper first to be skeptical, right? Sometimes you might want to, but it's really shameful, the type of research that is getting pawned off as though it supports these claims. Okay, we're going into the ideology, and I think that's the last of the slides I've got up there as far as the visuals go. But in the ideology here, I'm going to talk about some false categories, and then we're going to talk about some of the false assumptions that are built in. So first, false categories: sex assigned at birth, right, or biological sex, right? We use biological sometimes to clarify, but there's really, biological sex in itself is a redundant term, right? It's just your sex. Everyone has a sex, but you don't really have to specify further than that. But what's so insidious here is the term sex assigned at birth, right? So say, well, this is the sex that you have when you're born, and the doctor looks and says it's a boy or it's a girl, right? So the doctor's assigning your sex, and they write it down in a birth certificate. No one has to assign that, right? If you don't have a birth certificate, you still can't have a baby if you're a man, right? It doesn't matter if the doctor said anything or if anyone heard him. It doesn't matter if it's written down anywhere, right? Nothing has to be assigned. This is just a fact about your body, that you have a male reproductive system or a female reproductive system, meaning you are male or female. And of course, there's nothing about birth that relates to that, right? The baby has a sex defined from the moment of conception, right? If you could do a genetic test on the embryo at any time, as soon as it's been conceived, it has a sex already defined. There's nothing at birth that changes about that one way or another. Now, one area I do want to talk about here is intersex conditions, because these are sometimes used sort of as a wedge to get people to back off the idea of the dichotomy of it's just male and female. Because there is such thing as intersex conditions, which means people whose physical bodies bear traits of both sexes, or it's unclear, which sex they should properly be understood to be. This is, if you're maybe a little bit older, maybe more familiar with the term hermaphrodites. Right? That would be the idea of someone bearing traits, chromosomes, or organs of both sexes. Hermaphroditism is one of the intersex conditions. And so the idea here is, well, you've got all these different intersex conditions, and so it's really a spectrum. It's sort of this sliding bar between male and female. So who's to say if I'm, 75% to male, maybe I'm 70, and it's shorter to go the 20% to the female side, then your subjective impression might come into play or something, right? That's the idea, that it's not just fixed, one or the other. The commonly cited statistic by transgender activists would be that intersex people are 1.7% of the population, and that is from a study, a paper. I should say a paper rather than a study. That's another thing. Some of those papers cited were not studies. They were discussions of current practices, where no study was involved. Sorry. So 1.7% would be about the same percentage of the population that has red hair. And you think, oh, well, that's fairly common, right? Okay, it's grossly misleading. Using the same data, and I found a great paper on this. If this is something that you are interested about, I'm happy to send you. It's not a long one. It's maybe 4 pages or something like this, of a guy critiquing the paper that resulted in this 1.7% survey, and just walking through the different conditions that are listed, what percentages they are, and that sort of thing. So of that 1.7%, it's like 88% of it is people who have late onset androgen insensitivity. So meaning later on, as an adult, your body has a harder time accepting the hormones that are more characteristic of your sex, which could result in infertility later on. The primary symptom in males who have late onset androgen insensitivity is thinning hair, though that only occurs in 50% of patients. So it's like, most of these people are going to have no idea that they even have such a condition and have no symptoms. And yet that's 88% of the 1.7% of so-called intersex people, which would not be a recognized intersex condition, right? Not helpful clinically at all. The incidence of actual intersex conditions from that 1.7% is 0.018%, so 100 times less. And of those, true hermaphrodism, which would be the condition in which it is actually difficult, even with all the data, even seeing the chromosomes and everything, difficult to determine, should we call this person a man or a woman? That'd be true hermaphrodism, is 0.0012%. So vanishingly small numbers. Not these people don't exist, but it's not 1.7% of the population, not even close. So the numbers are much more rare than those cited by activists. The second point would be intersex conditions are pathologies. They do not represent a third way to have a reproductive system. Right? They're not, typically, almost all the intersex conditions result in infertility. And there's no such thing as an intersex condition where a person as a man can be fertile. There's no intersex condition in which that person could father a child. There are some conditions where a woman may still be able to have children, but not the other way. And typically it results in infertility. But they are not a third way to, apart from being male-female, they are a disordering at some point. Somewhere where there's a genetic disorder, where there are specifically organs that are not fully developed, appropriate to the person's sex, and so not functional and that sort of thing. And then third would be intersex conditions are an objective physical condition. Right? No one's denying the existence of intersex people, but that has nothing to do with whether your gender is defined subjectively in your head, apart from your body. Totally different issue than an actual physical condition, in which there may be ambiguity about a person's sex. Okay, so that's the first false category, be sex assigned at birth. No, there's just sex, and it's male or female. Those are the two functional sexes for humans. Second would be gender identity. Okay, so this is whether you feel like a man or a woman, but what does that even mean? If I'm a man, then whatever I am thinking are thoughts that a man thinks. Even if I'm thinking, I feel feminine today, well, that's something a man's thinking, right? Because I'm a man. How can I know if it feels the same or different to be a woman? You would have to experience both conditions in order to know if there's a difference and be able to compare them, right? Like, I haven't been in a woman's head to know if, oh, that's actually how I feel, or to know that it's different. It's just an incoherent idea to think that a man's brain could recognize that it's thinking the thoughts that are characteristic of a woman's brain. And so what would be the standard for judging that I feel more like a man or woman? Well, it's gender stereotypes. And that's the big irony, is that supposedly we're breaking down the gender stereotypes, but in fact, the whole idea of feeling more like a man or woman depends on strong gender stereotypes, right? He likes dolls more than trucks, and he wants to paint his nails. Must be a girl, right? It's like, okay, we've got the 1950s, like man and woman, and if you don't fall into one of those, you're a third sex, or you're the opposite sex or something like that. So because it's so subjective and there's no way to, verify that or get outside your own head, it depends on gender stereotypes, which is fascinating, right? that the ideology actually assumes the legitimacy of the gender stereotypes, right? That is really what it means to be a man. So that if you would rather dress in pink, or you'd rather rock a baby than play football, then you really might not be a man. It's affirming those sort of strict gender stereotypes. Now, and we're told that claiming a gender identity that doesn't match your actual sex is expressing your more authentic self. Right? That's what you affirm their identity. But that's clearly the opposite of true, right? Identifying with the sex you are not is by definition less authentic. Right? It's like the definition of not being authentic. And that's demonstrated in the fact that individuals who decide that they're transgender make an effort to hide the distinctive features of their sex. Right? That's why they get chest binders for girls, and that's why they are going to, if you're a guy, you're going to be shaving or trying to use some treatment to get rid of the facial hair, or if you're a girl saying you're a guy, you're going to be, or I guess a guy, you're saying you're a girl, you may be embarrassed about the size of your hands or something. You have to try to hide the distinctive features of your own sex, and a disguise is a mark of someone's inauthentic identity, right? Not an authentic identity. So that would be a denial rather than an affirmation of your true self. On the categories of gender presentation and attraction or sexual orientation, we're not going to go into any detail on those just for time today, but we do want to note that they're identified as separate and independent categories from the others, right? The idea being you have these 4 different categories of gender identity, sexuality, biological sex, and gender presentation that are all kind of independent variables, Okay, so I want to dig now into some of the false assumptions built in here. And I think exposing these, spending some time on these can help to see clearly why these ideas are so destructive to a person's soul. So 1, we can define ourselves or assert our own identities. Right? That's true sometimes. I can say, I'm going to be a great dad, and then sort of, make myself into that person, if you will, by something I do. I can say I'm an introvert, where I'm defining myself in terms of something you might not know about me that's, subjective and internal. But here we're talking about defining ourselves in relation to a characteristic that is physical and external, and that does not work, right? We can't define our own height or our own age or our own race. And those are all things that do actually exist on a continuum and are more subjective, right? Who's to say what's tall and what's short? It's going to depend on, who you're around. Who's to say if you're young or old? Well, I feel young, So does that mean you can just define your own age? That the 16-year-old can just say, yeah, I'm old enough to drink, No, it doesn't work that way. And sex is actually a more fixed and objective and less mutable characteristic than the others. People do actually go through different ages and heights. They don't go through different sexes. Number 2, our true internal identity might be at odds with our own body. Okay, think about that. Your true self, I might be female on the inside, but my body is male. So the two parts of me might actually be in opposition to each other, right? Like this irreconcilable opposition. So if your body and your identity are at war with each other, then no matter who wins, you lose, right? Either your body loses or your identity loses, and they're both you. So you can see, it's no wonder that the poor people who are led to follow this path are miserable. And that was in some of those studies too, that they are miserable, in increased negative psychological outcomes, to frame it more clinically. Number 3 would be our body is not an essential part of our identity as individuals. And your body is not central to who you are. Your identity is independent of your body, which means your body must be secondary. So then also number 4, our physical sex, our gender identity, our appearance, our dress or mannerisms, and our sexual behavior are all unconnected. These things are all, different pieces that we have to try to force together somehow in ourselves, but they don't have any inherent connection. And so, number 5, therefore, we're made of disconnected, unintegrated parts, which may even be at odds with each other, as we saw with the identity and the body, right? There's no united you. You've got a collection of these different parts and pieces that all interact independently and on their own, and they may actually be in tension, in an unreconcilable sort of tension. So you're not an integrated, unified individual. Number 6, our bodies don't tell us anything about what we ought to do or be. So that means they don't carry any inherent purpose or meaning. Rather, we decide their purpose and meaning, and the purpose we give them might be different than what they're actually built for. So they might be working against their own purpose, right? I decide the purpose of my body is to be a woman, and it's fighting me on that, right? And so then 7 would be our purpose is defined internally by ourselves, meaning we have no objective purpose, right? There's no purpose outside. There's nothing I can latch onto. This is what I'm for. This is what I'm made to do. We don't come with any inherent purpose, and indeed different parts of us may have different competing purposes. What miserable conclusions, right? I mean, just look at those. No wonder, you can read that and think, obviously, someone who believes these things is going to have more psychological issues. You are literally disintegrating the person, right? Okay, so there's a Christian alternative. We don't have to accept that we're purposeless, fragmented people at odds with our own bodies. The Christian alternative would be we are created with a purpose as a unified whole, body and soul. Right? The Bible tells us we've been made, we have a creator. That means we can have a real purpose. He has intent for us. We are actually, we're required to have a real purpose because in order for something to have a true purpose, it has to be made for it. And we are made to glorify God, to reflect him and know him. We're a unified whole. Because we have a creator and we have the purpose, we're whole integrated beings. That means all our parts are built for the same purpose, right? They can and are intended to work together toward the same goal, not at odds with each other. And so our recognition of our sex, what our bodies are, has implications for how we dress and behave, for how we relate to the opposite sex. So our identity is all of a piece, and it informs, that one part informs another, so that we can understand ourselves as a single whole individual made for a unified purpose. And of course, as a body and soul, our bodies are a part of that unified whole. Our bodies are really a part of who we truly are. They're a good thing, right? The value and goodness of the body in Christianity can be seen, illustrated well in three key doctrines. One, creation, right? God made us with bodies. He saw that it was good. That was his idea, and he pulled it off. That's a good thing. You have bodies. Two, at the incarnation, because God himself takes on a body that he will bear for eternity. So he is both affirming the value of the body and then redeeming it for all eternity. And third, the resurrection. We don't believe that we die and we become floating spirits as our end goal, but we will actually be resurrected in physical bodies, to live in bodies eternally. So our body is a good thing, and it is something that is a central part of us. But then we have the effect of sin. This is also central to the Christian understanding, that we can acknowledge that we don't always feel whole or purposeful or at peace with ourselves, right? Sin distorts and damages our understanding of ourselves. It corrupts our sexual desires, and it corrupts our willingness to live according to God's purpose for us, even in relation to our own bodies. We are not perfectly whole and unified individuals now, even if we want to be and are trying to aspire to be that. We're broken and corrupted people. We all feel uncomfortable to some degree in our bodies, right? In that sense, we're all transgender, right? Has anyone ever felt discomfort with their own body? Yes, that is just part of being human, right? That is natural. It's not a sign that you're in the wrong body, right? It's a sign that you're human and that you're under the effects of sin. We all feel lost and unsure and at war with ourselves because we're not in communion with our Creator as we should be. But the solution is not to have one part of our identity control and triumph over the others. Right? The solution is to be reconciled to God. There is actually the possibility of healing and wholeness, to be restored and cleansed. So the solution is to repent of our sins and give our lives to Jesus, the one who gave them their purpose and who can put them back together. Oh, isn't that beautiful? So we're pretty much out of time, but just a couple guidelines here. A couple, 8. How should Christians address these issues in public? One, do speak up. And don't feel like you can't speak up because you haven't dealt with this personally or within your own family, right? I don't know anyone who's transgender, so I don't feel like I can speak to it. It's more difficult for the people who have family members to speak out, even if they can see the negative effects, right? Because now they might be compromising their relationship with the person who they're trying not to lose. So speak out and speak clearly. Don't put all that weight on the people who have extra skin in the game or who have more to lose from speaking out. Don't go along with lies, right? Don't give tacit approval to this. Don't use false names or pronouns to the degree that you are aware of it and can. And our second panel on LGBTQ issues went into a lot more detail of suggestions for in the workplace, in relationships, how to go about not lying and speaking the truth and not trying to make yourself insufferable in every situation, right? We should publicly oppose the acceptance of transgender ideology and legalization and the normalization of these procedures. Sports is the area where they're starting to lose the debate, which is good in that the tide is turning. It's sad in what it reflects of us. We're, I think, maybe more concerned about our kids getting their trophies than we are about the people who are actually having the gender surgeries with their parents' approval and then ruining their lives, becoming a perpetual medical patient who will never find a partner and never have children, and be dealing with the ramifications of that forever. That's the huge negative. Those people who are really suffering from these things, people who are asking for them, and then getting them. And so it is actually an act of love to try to prevent these things from being legalized or promoted publicly. Again, to the degree that we're able. And then this movement is already starting to collapse. The UK, Finland, Norway have all banned these procedures, even the hormone treatments for kids. France is on the way to do that. The US is really the heart of this ideology, but you can see it's already fraying at the edges. Our witness is going to be much better served by being the people who are willing to say the truth when it wasn't popular than of going along and helping people in their lives, and then people find out later, well, you weren't even willing to speak up, when I was going through this or when I was being pushed into these procedures. Okay, and then in private relationships, again, say do not lie, do not use new pronouns or new names. That is tacit approval. Be the person's tether to reality, lovingly, of course. Ask questions. We've seen the ideology is really weak when examined, but people captured by it think that they understand something about gender more profoundly than you do, and so ask the questions. Say, well, tell me more about that. I must be missing something here. It sounds like this is just based on gender stereotypes. Is it something else? Like, what is it? What's that sense of male or female? How would you know that? Let people talk about it so that they can see that it has these holes. And frame your rejection of the ideology as an affirmation of their personal value, right? We're talking about that Christian alternative. We can say, you know what, I actually think that your body is a good thing, that it's not the wrong one, that God made you that way for a good purpose, and that you don't have to reject it. We don't have to frame it as though, no, you're right, you can't be that way, I hate you, right? We can frame it as, I can't affirm this because I don't think you're a mistake. I think you're made in the image of God, And then in all cases, I'd say present that positive alternative. Don't just say, no, that's nonsense. You're a lunatic. You're mentally unwell. But you can say, I believe our bodies are good. I believe they have real purpose. Or I believe that we can each be a unified whole, that the parts of us don't have to be at war with each other, and they shouldn't be. And then, last of all, don't be intimidated by scientific consensus, right? We can see even the national health organizations, even the professors at Harvard get captured by this nonsensical ideology, and forever after, it's going to be, well, you guys are the same people who told us that a man can be a woman, like that used to be sort of the standard for something that's obviously false or contradictory. And if the whole sort of scientific or medical establishment can be captured by something like that, then yeah, don't be intimidated when they tell you something that appears to be nonsense. It just might be. All right, we're right up to time, so I'll pray and we'll close. Thank you for your attention. Father, we thank you for giving us the opportunity to reflect on these things. We thank you that you have made us and that you've given us your word. We pray that you would give us clarity and love as we articulate it, and that we would be a light, that your church would be there to help people who are fleeing from and damaged by this diabolical ideology, and that we would be there to help them with open arms and also with clear and unwavering truth. In Jesus' name, amen.